Welcome to the Memory Scope channel. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out more videos like this one.
A newly engaged John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier paused together in 1953, their youth and quiet confidence carrying no hint of the extraordinary life that American history would ask of them both. Long before the crown defined her, a young Queen Elizabeth served as an ambulance driver during the Second World War, choosing the uniform of an ordinary citizen over any shelter that her royal position might have offered. Around 1898 in the Belgian Congo, missionary and photographer Alice Seeley Harris documented a rubber plantation worker, her lens bearing quiet witness to the brutal human cost concealed beneath colonial industry. In 1983, two icons of human ambition shared the same sky, the Space Shuttle riding atop NASA's modified 747 shuttle carrier aircraft, while the Concorde cut a clean line across the horizon behind them. Photographed by Pietro Masturzo for L'Espresso magazine, this image outside Hebron captures a Palestinian woman confronting the daily reality of life in contested territory, where the ordinary act of moving through one's own land carries weight. In the highlands of Hadramaut, Yemen, female goat herders go about their work, carrying forward a way of life shaped by landscape, labor, and generations of quiet endurance. Beginning in 2019, Samuel Bateman of Colorado City, Arizona, manipulated 3 men into surrendering the women of their families to him, establishing a splinter group known as the Samuelites, built entirely around his self-declared prophetic authority. Founded in the 1980s by Jerusalem-born Shlomo Helbrands, Lev Tahor, meaning pure heart in Hebrew, drew secular Jews toward an ultra-Orthodox life shaped by anti-Zionist doctrine and a commanding religious authority Helbrands cultivated from his years in a yeshiva. In 1941, a boy eats a piece of bread on the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto, his small act of survival set against the deliberate starvation and confinement that defined daily existence within those walls. In 1925, Norwegian musher Gunnar Kaasen and his lead dog Balto completed the final leg of a desperate relay across Alaska, delivering diphtheria antitoxin to Nome and saving the city from an epidemic that had threatened its children. India's Chandrayaan-1 spacecraft captured the Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 landing sites from lunar orbit in 2021, providing visual evidence from an independent mission that quietly and firmly answers those who continue to deny that humanity walked on the moon. Matthew McConaughey appears in a Delta Tau Delta fraternity composite photograph from the University of Texas at Austin around 1989. A casual college portrait carrying no suggestion of the decades of recognition that lay quietly ahead. In May 1942, at the Small Arms plant in Long Branch, Ontario, a worker stands proudly beside a finished Sten submachine gun, one link in the industrial chain that Canada quietly and steadily built to arm the Allied effort. In 1960, a young girl training in civil rights activism sits composed and still as smoke is deliberately blown into her face, learning through practice the discipline of nonviolent resistance that the movement asked of even its youngest participants. English schoolboys stare in open disbelief at physique model Steve Coates in 1964, their expressions capturing that universal moment of youth, encountering something entirely outside the boundaries of ordinary expectation. Ozzy Osbourne and Sharon stand together in 1985, their appearance a perfect expression of the era they inhabited, unapologetic, bold, and entirely at home in the world of rock and roll they had made their own. For over 800 years and across 33 generations, one German family has lived within the same medieval castle. Its stones, holding not just history but an unbroken thread of belonging, stretching back further than most nations remember. In 305 CE, the Roman Emperor Diocletian became the first ruler in history to voluntarily abdicate his throne, retreating to grow vegetables in Croatia and famously declining every appeal to return by pointing instead to the cabbages he had planted with his own hands. Gabriel Fernandez was 8 years old and living in Palmdale, California, when he died as a result of severe abuse inflicted by his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, a story that drew national attention to the failures of the systems meant to protect children. A Constantinople street scene from 1912 preserves a city still living under the Ottoman Empire, its pavements and storefronts holding the ordinary rhythm of a place whose name, language, and identity were about to be reshaped by the decade ahead. On April 28, 1945, the USS Franklin, her deck twisted and scarred from a Japanese dive bomber attack that had killed over 800 of her crew on March 19th, made her slow and remarkable approach into New York Harbor to dock at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In 1900 in Oklahoma City, Apache Chief Geronimo sits for a portrait alongside his two nieces, a quiet image made just 14 years after his final surrender ended decades of resistance against the United States military. Marketed in New York in 1936, the dimple maker was a spring-loaded device worn around the jaw with small knobs designed to press into the cheeks over time, offering its buyers the promise of beauty through patient mechanical pressure. Chichen Itza, as it appeared in 1892 and as it stands today, presents a striking study in rediscovery. The jungle reclaimed ruins of one photograph, giving way to the carefully restored monument now visited by millions each year. A Victorian woman photographed in the 1880s looks directly into the camera with a composed stillness that portraiture of the era demanded. Her image, one of the earliest generations to sit for a lens rather than a painter's brush. The giant manuscripts held in Prague Castle stand as testament to the painstaking labor of medieval scribes, their oversized pages carrying sacred and civic texts that illuminators and copyists gave years of their lives to produce. Tbilisi-born Soviet water polo player Petre Mshvenyaradze holds his grandson in 1950, the warmth of the moment entirely private and entirely human against the backdrop of an Olympic career that carried him far from that domestic quiet. On December 24, 1968, astronaut Bill Anders photographed the Earth rising above the lunar horizon from Apollo 8, the first crewed mission to orbit the Moon, producing an image that would permanently alter how humanity understood its own fragile place in space. The Buddhas of Bamiyan had stood in the cliffs of Afghanistan since the 6th century when the Taliban destroyed them in 2001, erasing in hours what 1,500 years of conquest, weather, and time had left standing. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg airship caught fire and collapsed while approaching Lakehurst, New Jersey, killing 35 of the 97 people aboard, in a disaster that was photographed by multiple cameras and broadcast live on radio to a stunned public. On October 9, 1967, Che Guevara was executed in the Bolivian countryside following his capture by Bolivian forces with CYA support, and Freddy Alborta's photograph of his body, compared by critics to Mantegna's painting of the dead Christ, circulated around the world the following day. In 1932, a man walked the streets carrying a sign demanding the return of his life savings of $2,950 from Bankers Trust on Wall Street. His one-man protest captured by Fred Zinnemann as a quiet emblem of the Great Depression's human toll. Taken in 1875, this photograph of a pet, posed in a deliberately silly arrangement, reminds us that the impulse to find humor and tenderness in animals is not a modern invention, but something people have carried with them for as long as cameras have existed. A woman stands beside a towering redwood tree in the 1950s, her figure reduced to something almost incidental by the scale of the ancient trunk beside her, a living thing old enough to have been growing long before any nation claimed the land beneath its roots. In 1925, a police officer halted the flow of traffic along an entire street to hold space for a cat carefully carrying her kitten across the road. A small moment of patience and decency preserved without irony by whoever held the camera. Standing before the massive trunk of a giant sequoia in California in 1917, a group of loggers hold their crosscut saw to scale, the image capturing the full size of what the timber industry of that era was systematically removing from the American landscape. A wagon train moves through Nevada along the California Trail in the 1860s, following a route that by 1869 had carried an estimated 450,000 people westward, many of them crossing the waterless 40-mile stretch between Lovelock and Fernley, where wagons were still found wrecked in the desert decades later. A young couple poses together in the 1920s, their closeness and ease in front of the camera carrying the same uncomplicated warmth that photographs of people in love have always managed to hold, regardless of the era surrounding them. Children celebrating Easter in 1926 face the camera with an unguarded joy that needs no context or caption, their happiness entirely legible across the nearly 100 years that separate that moment from the eye reading it now. In Weimar, Germany, in 1923, children play with bricks made from bundled currency, the casual scene encoding one of history's most severe economic collapses, a hyperinflation so total that paper money had become more useful as a building material than as a means of exchange. A rotary dial-wall telephone from the 1970s sits as a quiet artifact of an era when calling someone required patience, physical engagement, and the full commitment of standing in one place until the conversation was done. The 1937 Western Clipper motorhome represents an early vision of self-contained road travel, its streamlined body suggesting a belief that freedom and comfort could be carried together down any highway the open road offered. Freddie Mercury and David Gilmour, two of rock music's most defining voices, were photographed together in London on the 18th of February 1990, just over a year before Mercury's death would make images like this one feel irreplaceable. On July 1, 1969, an undercover police officer works his assignment in Brooklyn's 78th precinct, his presence in the frame a rare glimpse into the plainclothes surveillance that operated just beneath the visible surface of New York City's streets. Camberly Kate, known formally as Kate Ward, devoted her life in England to the care of stray dogs, taking in more than 600 animals over her lifetime and turning away none of them, photographed here in 1962 surrounded by a few of her many quiet dependents. At the 1971 Glastonbury Festival in England, priests and hippies stand together in easy conversation, their contrasting appearances reflecting a moment when traditional institutions and countercultural movements briefly occupied the same muddy field without apparent conflict. Two photographs taken from the same location in the Arctic, 100 years apart, place side by side the evidence of what a century of climate change has done to the ice. the contrast between them requiring no annotation to make its point. On May 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy rode through Washington with Ivory Coast President Félix Houphouët-Boigny in a bubble-top limousine, a diplomatic meeting between two leaders whose nations were navigating very different but equally consequential passages through the early 1960s. Somewhere around 1863, an American Civil War soldier set down the gravity of the conflict long enough to clown for the camera, leaving behind a reminder that even in the middle of history's most terrible events, people reached for laughter wherever they could find it. Photographs of Athens taken in 1862 and today set the ancient city's ruined monuments against the dense modern sprawl that has grown around them, the Parthenon visible in both frames as the one fixed point across more than a century and a half of transformation. In the early 20th century, outdoor baby cages were mounted on apartment windowsills to give infants access to fresh air and sunlight in cities where green space was scarce, a solution that addressed one problem with a casualness toward another that later generations would find difficult to fathom. In 1937, at Whipsnade Zoo, 8-week-old tiger cubs discover that their keeper makes a perfectly acceptable climbing post, their instinctive boldness entirely indifferent to whatever professional dignity the situation might have otherwise required. In 1943, workers carefully applied protective coverings to the Taj Mahal's iconic dome and minarets to shield the monument from potential aerial bombardment during the Second World War, an act of cultural preservation carried out quietly while the conflict raged around it. In 1959, Elvis Presley signs an autograph directly onto a boy's head, the casual intimacy of the gesture capturing something genuine about the era's relationship between celebrity and fan, personal, close, and entirely without the managed distance that fame would later demand. Ham the chimpanzee smiles aboard recovery vessels in 1961, following his historic flight on Mercury Redstone. 2. His expression, whatever its true meaning, perfectly matching the mood of the humans who had sent him into space and brought him safely home. On October 22, 1895, a locomotive traveling too fast to stop on time crashed through the terminal wall of the Montparnasse station in Paris, its engine hanging dramatically over the street below in a wreck that, remarkably, killed only one person on the ground. In 1931, Louis Wicks Hine photographed a construction worker on the Empire State Building high above Manhattan, one of thousands of men who built the skyscraper that would briefly become the tallest structure on Earth at a time when workplace safety was rarely the priority it is today. At Southam Park Zoo in Warwickshire in 1971, a chimpanzee carefully feeds a leopard cub, their interaction across species lines drawing from spectators the same mixture of delight and disbelief that images of unlikely animal bonds have always produced. A young Bruce Lee plays with his brother Robert in Hong Kong, the photograph belonging to a period of his life that predates the films and the global fame. A childhood moment that looks, in every way, like just a childhood moment. On a railway platform in Bristol in 1936, a young passenger leans toward a station attendant for directions, the scene carrying the particular quiet of a child navigating an adult world with the careful seriousness that the task demands. In London in 1944, a soldier lifts a girl named Barbara James from the ruins of her bombed home, the rescue unfolding amid the structural wreckage of a city that had absorbed years of bombardment while continuing, somehow, to sustain its daily life. Around 1890, the Russian writer and philosopher Leo Tolstoy sits with his grandchildren as he tells them a story, the great literary architect of War and Peace reduced, in the most generous and human sense, to the simpler role of a grandfather holding a room of children with his voice. The Hollywood sign as it appeared in 1924 read, Hollywoodland, a real estate advertisement built to promote a hillside development, before the final 4 letters were quietly removed in 1949, and the truncated version became one of the most recognized landmarks on Earth. Adolf Hitler was photographed in lederhosen at some point during his rise to power, an image he found so undignified that he personally forbade its publication, a rare moment in which the carefully constructed image of absolute authority slipped into something awkward and ordinary. On June 8, 1968, as Robert F. Kennedy's funeral train carried his body slowly from New York to Washington, his widow, Ethel Kennedy, 37 years old and already a mother of 10 with an 11th child on the way, held her family together through a grief the watching nation could only partly comprehend. In Belgrade in 1988, the director of a Yugoslav zoo conducts what the photograph presents as a negotiation with an escaped chimpanzee, a scene that, whatever its practical resolution, contains more visible dignity on both sides than most diplomatic encounters manage. In Vienna in 1946, a prisoner of war returns home, Ernst Haas's photograph capturing the fragile stillness of a man stepping back into a life that the war had suspended for years and that no amount of waiting had fully prepared him to re-enter. A German officer and an NCO on the Western Front in 1917 wear portable sound locating devices designed to detect approaching enemy aircraft, the cumbersome apparatus representing an early attempt to solve by engineering a problem that the speed and scale of modern warfare had made suddenly urgent. In May 1945, a woman moves through the ruins of Berlin as the Battle of Berlin draws to its close, her solitary figure crossing a landscape of destruction that marks the end of a war Germany itself had begun less than 6 years earlier. The Queen of England and her husband attend the horse races in 1968, their presence at the track carrying the familiar blend of royal tradition and genuine personal enthusiasm for equestrian sport that would define her public leisure throughout her reign. In France, in 1902, knife grinders worked lying flat on their boards to protect their backs from the strain of the job, with dogs placed across their legs for warmth. A working arrangement that captured, in its small practical details, the particular hardships of that trade. A Victorian couple, photographed in the 1890s, struggles visibly against the urge to laugh, their suppressed amusement breaking through despite the long exposure times and stern social conventions that formal portraiture of the era typically demanded and rarely defeated. A public bathroom in Europe, photographed around 1940, stands as a quiet document of the infrastructure of daily life in a continent that was, in the same years, organizing and enduring one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. General George S. Patton's dog sits quietly on the day of his owner's death, December 21, 1945, the animal's stillness carrying the kind of unspoken loyalty that dogs have always offered and that this particular photograph makes almost unbearably legible. Alan Pinkerton, Abraham Lincoln, and General John McClernand stand together at Gettysburg in 1863 in this colorized photograph, the image placing the president in the field during a war that was remaking the country around every person visible in the frame. Coney Island on the 4th of July in 1949 holds a density of people that turns the beach itself into something more like a city, every inch of sand occupied by the same collective impulse to mark the holiday by gathering at the water's edge. In 1882, 6 years before abolition, photographer Mark Ferrez documented enslaved people in Brazil's Paraíba Valley for photographs sent to European exhibitions to present Brazil as modern and progressive. Carefully composed images from which all visible evidence of violence was deliberately excluded. Taken in 1826 from the window of his house in France, Nicéphore Niepce's photograph required an exposure of several days, producing an image so faint it was considered lost for over a century before being rediscovered in 1952 inside a trunk, the oldest surviving photograph ever made. In Brussels in 1927, 29 of the world's leading scientists gathered for the Solvay Conference, among them Einstein, Curie, Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and Planck. A single room containing so much concentrated scientific genius that 17 of the 29 would go on to hold or had already received the Nobel Prize. Between 1905 and 1926, Harry Gardner scaled over 700 buildings across the United States and Europe using only his bare hands and feet, drawing crowds of up to 150,000 people, and charging the companies whose facades he climbed a fee for the publicity his ascent reliably produced. Photographed in 1989, the Kowloon-walled city in Hong Kong concentrated between 30,000 and 50,000 residents into just 2.5 hectares of ungoverned, chaotically stacked concrete, one of the most densely inhabited places ever to exist on Earth. In Biloxi, Mississippi in 1911, Lewis Hine photographed a 5-year-old child who had refused to be photographed after a full day of labor. The small act of resistance embedded within a larger body of work Hine produced for the National Child Labor Committee to document and challenge the use of child labor across the United States. In the Mojave Desert in 1962, engineers and designers tested a prototype spacesuit intended for the Apollo lunar landing program, the arid landscape offering conditions close enough to the moon's surface to reveal, under a California sun, what the suits would need to withstand. The last known photograph of Michael Rockefeller was taken in 1961, before he disappeared in Papua New Guinea while conducting fieldwork among the Asmat people. His fate never officially confirmed, and his disappearance leaving behind a story that decades of investigation have never fully resolved. Rising from the fields of Paris in 1888, the Eiffel Tower takes shape in stages across a construction photograph that documents what was then considered a temporary structure, a feat of iron engineering built for the 1889 World's Fair that would outlast every argument made for tearing it down. 3 people pose for a photograph in California in 1918, wearing face masks during the second wave of the Spanish flu, their practical precaution set against the invisibility of a pandemic that killed tens of millions of people across a world already exhausted by 4 years of war. A group of smiling Victorian boys photographed in 1898 look directly into the camera with an ease and energy that the era's formal portraiture conventions rarely encouraged, their expressions carrying the same uncomplicated liveliness that photographs of children have always managed to preserve. Rush hour in Chicago from more than a century ago presents streets dense with pedestrians, vehicles, and the general organized chaos of a city moving itself through the day, a scene different in every technical detail from the present but identical in its essential human pressure. Written by Anne Frank during her years in hiding and published after her death, these words, that no one need wait a single moment before beginning to improve the world, carry the particular weight of having been composed by a child who did not survive to see the world she imagined improving. On May 25, 1965, Muhammad Ali stood over Sonny Liston in Lewiston, Maine, in a photograph that became one of the most reproduced images in sports history, a moment of dominance captured at the precise second it was most complete. At the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, Jesse Owens stands on the medal podium giving a salute after winning gold in the long jump. His victory over Germany's Lutz Long, representing one of the most pointed athletic refutations of Nazi racial ideology the Games would produce. A soldier photographed in 1916 carries in his expression the particular vacancy that shell shock, only beginning to be named and understood in those years, left on the faces of men whose minds had absorbed more than any human nervous system was built to hold. Ernest Hemingway, photographed during the First World War, before he had written a word of the fiction that would make him famous, looks out from the image as a young man whose experience of the conflict would quietly organize the prose he spent the rest of his life refining.